It's absolutely wonderful to get a chance to have a moment of community. There's a man in my life named Michael Mead, and if he's not somebody that you're familiar with, he's a mythologist, and he talks a lot about how community is an experience where people get together, and it's actually not this kind of non-local network of relationships that sort of are spread everywhere and lasts over time, but it's really like a ritual. It's a moment of gathering, and in any case, just so grateful to get to share in this moment of community and to introduce these amazing people who have come to join us to share some of the depth and rigor of science happening in this space and their passion and personal experience. And I'd love to introduce the people who are here to talk a bit about some of the road ahead from the perspective of science. But one other thing I'd love to say just before bringing them on is that, the Cultivation Classic is many things, and it's really an effort to kind of both in the gardens that we're associated with or this plant that we love, to have a kind of cultivation process and in our relationships, certainly. There are many aspects of that we need to really have strength to confront the challenges that we're facing as we go forward. And certainly, from hyper-ecological regenerative agriculture, sequestering carbon and working to build a livable future, and all the way through to the human health and therapeutic wellness revolution that this plant is a harbinger for and is bringing forward, and to the production science that is going to help to further those aims. And all of these themes are important to us and many others, but in any case, it's really exciting to get to share some geekery. I hope this is some deep geekery that you can enjoy. But I'd love to introduce the three people who are here to join us, all from different places. We have first Dr. Alison Justice, who has joined us from Southern Carolina. She works for a company named Outco and is the VP of horticulture there. I first saw Alison on a stage with the Fluence bioengineering team. Absolutely just incredible, laying waste to all sorts of rumors and myths that were unfounded in the cannabis production space. And if you haven't heard any of her podcasts, I'd highly recommend checking out Alison's work. So Alison, please, if you will. And then...
Thank you for having me, Jeremy.
And next up, I would love to bring to the table a new friend, an ally from Los Angeles. Guy Rocourt is here from Papa and Barkley, and is actually the only of the three of us who's less focused on production at this point from a cultivation perspective, although he has a rich and really long history working in that way as well, but he's really focusing on the value-add products. And if you're not familiar with the work of Papa and Barkley, it's quite an extensive impact that they've made, and they've done some very innovative things in especially regards to product purity. I'm sure most people are aware California has very stringent testing analytical standards, especially related to things like heavy metals that actually our Oregon community is not contending with at this moment, but he has a lot of experience working at scale with those products. And anyways, it's a tremendous honor to have Guy Rocourt here. And then lastly, it's my great honor to be able to introduce to you somebody that has really inspired in a lot of ways notions about how somebody that has studied at great depth the toxicology and metabolomic perspective of cannabis plants specifically, and plants, who now is arguably associated with some of the biggest R&D projects that are happening internationally with plant production research, and is somebody who also grew up with no running water or power, who has lived in various places in the international community. And I think outside of all the science that we're going to be talking about, his core passion is really hand building a cabin that he's going to be chilling out in the off hours to gain some kind of balance in his life as he's pursuing this wild amount of science and development. And this is Dr. Lasse Schulz. He's here from Cronos. So anyways, it's really exciting to say we've got almost an hour here, and we hope to go deep, and I want to get right to it. I think there's all sorts of personal narratives and anecdotes I'd love to dig into, but in fact, we're here to talk about the frontier and to really, as we have had a tradition in Cult Classic, sort of work to inspire our local producers and our community in Oregon, which is so strong, despite unbelievable challenges, having a state where we have a 7-year basically backlog of product and inventory in the state, a really inhospitable environment by any regard, probably historically the greatest commoditization pressure that's happened in any market, but then also all the challenges of an underground economy coming above board. And in any case, I want to make sure that we focus on the kind of resourcing of the challenges that we're confronted with. And I would like to start with just a little bit about, in each of your experience, if we could start with you, Alison, talking about some of the things that you've learned as you've come into this space with the depth and rigor of your scientific training, and some of the commonly held myths that you see in cannabis that may well be challenged by virtue of bringing the sort of science and inquiry and methodology into this dialogue.
Okay, well, let me see. Coming from an agricultural background, working with ornamental plants, we know very well just from years of data, what the plant needs in terms of nutrients. No matter the source, whether that's through organic fertilization or through synthetic, we have an idea for a healthy plant what these leaf tissue levels should be elementally. And so coming into cannabis, one of the biggest feats for me was to work through that because there's not much of a baseline as far as tissue analysis goes. Putting the notion to my growers that we don't actually need bottled nutrients. We can separate this into parts per million of all of the essential nutrients that the plants need, and kind of wrapping my head around. I see living soil. I see organic farmers, and the plants look absolutely phenomenal. They look like they have everything they need. And then I go into some of these very sterile indoor grows, which are using only synthetic fertilizers, and they look very bad. And so after having time in the cannabis industry, I've seen that that's not necessarily because the plants are grown with synthetic fertilizers. It's because we don't necessarily understand the basics or haven't grasped the basics of what we should feed a plant if we're feeding them only synthetic fertilizers. And so when you look at the bottled nutrients and you look what's going into the plant, the EC is just out of this world compared to any other plants, and compared to what you might be giving it in your living soil or your organic setup. And so the plants are struggling. The nutrients are there, they just can't take them up for one scientific reason or another, whether they're competing. And so, a good many of the indoor grows are not great looking because they aren't getting what they need because they're having a battle within the soil. And so, I think a lot of that notion comes from studies that were put out many, many years ago, because there are very few in terms of synthetic fertilizer. And, these plants were getting very high ppms or EC of different fertilizers, and we're applying that notion. But when you dig into the literature, these plants are getting it once a week, and we're feeding it daily. So basically, the plants aren't getting what they need. So I think there's a lot of R&D, a lot of exploration that needs to happen with fertilizing these plants properly in a synthetic sort of setup, because it can be done, and they can be produced, to be high quality.
Neat. I would like to bring myself into the conversation before we move on, because actually at Pruf Cultivar, one of the things that I've had the great privilege of working on in the last year and a half especially, there's a woman named Meg Houseman, who, if you don't know, is like just an absolutely remarkable character, who's also an agronomist who has worked to essentially do one of the most consistent organic crop production methods I've ever seen practiced in a facility. Similar to what you've expressed, I've been in facilities all over the world at this point, and I tell you, there's a lot of sick, unhappy plants out there, and a lot of smart people gathered around it. And then I even think about in small scale, sort of the hydroponic store culture we're coming out of, a lot of secret sauce, which of course our goal has always been to dispel secret sauce and have a really honest dialogue about the challenges. But at Pruf, one of the privileges in my experience has been to see this process where we took about 12 different inputs in the organic media that we're hand mixing. We test all of those through a third-party analytical testing partner to validate that we're not just looking at label strength, but actually finding what the actual nutrition is in these different things. We also include some like Korean natural farming methods, like adding bokashi and worm castings, but ultimately quantifying those inputs was a very important starting point. Then hand mixing these things and doing the testing on leachate, the runoff, the testing on substrate, sending in bits of the media, and when we can get access to tissue analysis, which has actually been the most spotty part, triangulate between these elements and understand the flow of nutrition through the plant over time. I think that most people at this point, if you listen to people growing in Colorado say, if you're in a commercial facility, you just can't do it organically. It's unreliable, nobody knows quite how it works, and it's going to bring in other sort of vectors for pathogens. And at the end of the day, I was just desperate to prove them wrong. But I actually, as we started down this path, took a pretty big risk and had about 8 to 9 months of kind of bumpy road. But at this point, I can say that we can talk about a specific weight of 1 grade of dolomite lime being added into a media for a particular group of cultivars and talk about exactly how that correlates with late-stage generative growth having calcium available. And it's like, it isn't impossible, it's hard. It takes a lot of testing, a lot of thought and effort if your goal is to produce a pretty consistent outcome and baseline from the rhizosphere dynamics and the nutrition perspective. But I am really proud to say at this point, I see unbelievable, thriving, flourishing plants always, and that to me is actually the most fundamental part of having morale. When you're slogging and you're working long hours and it's hard work and there's politics and you're in this market and it's crazy, but being around healthy, vibrant plants is one of the most important things. In any case, Alison, I know also in addition to nutrition, that you recently spoke about some other parts of the industry that I think is really exciting stuff to hit. But I was wondering if you could share just a little bit more about what you see happening once a plant is harvested, and maybe how the community has in general perceived these processes and what you're seeing.
Yeah, so for me, this is one of the most exciting parts. A lot of my work in grad school was in post-harvest, and so, we're looking at shipping millions of cuttings from, South America up to North America, and measuring, every metric that's involved in that, temperature, ethylene production. And the goal there is to keep this plant in stasis, where it can then grow roots and continue to thrive. And there's tons of research out there for, let's say, apples in post-harvest, and their goal is to keep them also in stasis. And there's certain metrics you measure for that. But the closest thing we have to compare to cannabis is tobacco, which, is good and bad, but we have to have some sort of starting ground. And so I've spent a lot of time looking through that research and trying to compare, at least have a grasp of what sort of metrics should we be looking at to then compare to cannabis. And, we've dug in deep, and, I come out with a lot of good information, but also even more so confused. We did studies where we had air sensors within buckets, and so I call this the burp experiment. And so we were measuring CO2, O2, ethylene, and humidity and temperature for burping. And, the one thing we found automatically is that the 5-gallon buckets everybody uses for curing from Home Depot, wherever, they're not airtight. So basically, we had our curing buckets in the room with the processors. And so every time the processors would come in the room, you'd see the CO2 climb, even though the buckets were sealed. And then when people started going home for work, the CO2 would go down. But in opposite, when looking at relative humidity, people are always saying, well, the burp is to release humidity. Well, how much can be released if it's only 30 seconds? Or maybe your method is an hour. That all depends. But for our experiment, we had a 15-minute and a 30-minute burp. And so, what you would see is that the humidity would drop down to be whatever, match up with our sensor that was just in the room. And then once the lid was put back on, it'd go back to basically baseline. So there was no true release of moisture in that sort of metric. But I guess the most interesting thing we saw in this burp experiment is that it was homogenization. So I think we can all agree on that. That was something that, a lot of people would say, well, you cure it and it's homogenizing, the moisture that is. And so, we were taking water activity, which is just a measure of available water at the beginning of cure. And so you can think about it as, the bud is a certain water activity on the surface level. That's the only place it measures. Well, after the 14 days, the water activity was higher, so there's more moisture. Well, the bucket wasn't gathering moisture from the environment, it was just homogenizing throughout that bud. And so all of your bud within that bucket were the same water activity. So that was, interesting, something that we all thought, but we were just able to put that data point on it and know for certain that is what's happening.
Can you describe just a little bit about the distinction between moisture content and water activity?
Yes. So, it's different in that, let's see, water activity is the metric that most of the food industry uses. So if you're drying beef jerky or beans or whatever else, you want to make sure that your product is dried to a certain water activity in which microbes will not continue to grow. And so for most food, that's about 0.6. For cannabis, what we've found is that if you're able to dry very quickly to about a 0.8, botrytis will not continue to grow at that water activity. And so, there's tons more research to apply to this. But when looking through the literature, the plant stops its enzymatic activities at about 0.7 and below. And so what we do is we keep our dry room, we drop it to the 0.8 very quickly where there's no botrytis growth, and then we let it ride for a while. We do it for 2 weeks. Could we do it in 1 week? Very possibly. More research to come. But we let it ride where, who knows what's happening. The chlorophyll breakdown, the, starch to sugar conversion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then it's dropped very fast at the last day or two, just to get to the water content that a consumer would like, that's nice to smoke. But it is very closely related to moisture content. Moisture content is the absolute value of water that is in that material you're measuring, where water activity is basically where the amount that is available for microbial growth. So even though that there's water there, it might be hidden within a cell and it's not available, if that makes sense.
It does. And in Oregon, this is huge stuff because I don't know how many other people in the room lose crops routinely related to botrytis cinerea, but this is a consistent expression that I think really is an area of focus that needs to be, we have a lot of learning to do about, which, one more question. I'm just curious if you could shine light on where you think research and the tools of science will continue to help improve our post-harvest process. What sort of questions are the most important questions given all of the things that we don't know, whether it's the accumulation of ethylene or other things you've brought up?
Oh, goodness. That's a tough one.
There's a lot of scientists in the room who are going to go out and be hunting for these things. We need to,
absolutely. I think every bit of it has to be looked at. Once we do figure out, well, is ethylene good or bad? I don't even know that question. I do know that the plant, once it's harvested and it's in the curing bucket, it produced so much ethylene that my sensor was malfunctioning. I wasn't able to complete the experiment because it was just so much. Is that good or bad? Do we need to put ethylene blockers in the buckets, or is it actually doing something good to speed up one of these processes? So that one's one that, we need to jump on really quick. Do we need to look at it like tobacco, where is there some sort of fermentation process going on? I don't know. But what I do know is that, with hemp coming on board, there are universities across the country, University of Georgia, Clemson, that their researchers are finally able to get their hands on plants and really help us out with some of this stuff. They have this really expensive equipment that they can, point us in the right direction. So we got to look at it all.
Exciting, and great point that as hemp comes online, suddenly you see academic resources coming into this effort, which, I mean, up until now, we're all in our own little weird private walled ecosystems doing the best we can to kind of understand these things. But really the debut of like proper academic and public benefit science is really just beginning. And anyways, those are great points. Thank you so much. Before we go on, do either of you have anything that you'd like to say about any of that content?
Yeah, I did want to comment on the nutrient lockout and the need to over fertilize plants. I think that's a legacy from the black market, and it's happening in two ways. Indoor growers want to put more ferts in and want to push their plants. It's all based on yield, and that's like a product of the black market, like a desperate need to get the most out of every plant. And in Humboldt, where we grow outdoors, what we're seeing now is that nutrient runoff is probably the worst thing for the environment. And where we would have probably regulated way more farms, you know, the county, rightfully so, is like really putting a stop on it because they're afraid of nutrient runoff and it's destroying the watershed. It's like, it's so funny, the worst thing for the environment right now is cannabis, and that makes no sense. And a lot of it has to do with small farmers, again, over-fertilizing. The gentleman that was here earlier said something about the autoflower plants, like, don't do anything. Less is more. I mean, I found that out as an indoor grower years ago. Less is more. I mean, the plant does not need that much. And like, yeah, when the salinity or the EC gets past 2,000 and you're in nutrient lockout, it's like, why? Now you're just wasting it and the plant's not accessing it anyway. You'd be better off with fresh water. So that's something that I think we all need to think about as we go into commercial growing. It's not all about yield. It really should be about quality, and it should be about what the plants need. And now that we can ask questions and we can, share data, it really shouldn't be about can I push this plant for the biggest cola for the max yield, right? And then when I was growing, we'd grow these buds and we'd use these protein like plant hormones, and what would happen is you get this big flower, but it'd only be 16% oil because all you did was grow biomass, right? So what makes a good plant? Is it the oil content? I would say yes, but then of course, terpene, and of course, making sure that we get the different cannabinoids and encourage those to grow. Those are the things we should be looking at, not just yield.
Yeah, I can also comment on plant nutrition a little bit. I like to see the plant and let the plant tell the story, what it actually needs. And Jeremy, to your point, having the nutrient analysis inside the plant, in the medium and in the effluent, and what actually you are fertilizing is incredibly important to understand what the plant takes out of your nutrient composition. These nutrients can be supplied organically or synthetically. The plant will not be distinguish in nitrate, whether it comes through ammonification and nitrification in an organic setting, or if it comes from a synthetic fertilizer. The plant doesn't care so much. But what does care is about a proper ratio of the nutrients that it's able to pick up. I think synthetic fertilizers have received a very, very bad reputation because the plant reacts very quickly to these synthetic fertilizers if that is not applied. Organic growing, we have a much better buffer. The cation exchange capacity in soils is very high and compared to, for example, rock wool medium. I think this is where some more consideration needs to be taken. Plants can grow in an inorganic setting and an organic setting equally well. Just that if you're growing, for example, in a rock wool medium, which creates just a matrix, has no nutritional value, you have to be much more careful what you're actually supplying the plant. But you can, if you're doing it right, you can grow very successfully, whether it's like in a rock wool medium or in an organic setting.
And of course, bringing up some of the point that you just referenced, Keith, I'm aware that the Eel River and other areas where there's been intensive cannabis production in Northern California, we now see really painful fallout from the applications of synthetic fertilizers at scale. Of course, if everybody's not aware, if it's the release of nitrates and phosphates and these compounds continuing to flow in effluent into the hydrological cycle, there's tremendous impact that we've lost more than 50% of the fresh water on Earth as a result of contamination from fertilizer. And Further, I don't know if most people know, but how fertilizer is harvested, where do we get nitrogen from? It's in the air. But in order to get the nitrogen to precipitate from the air to create these fertilizers, there's a very energy-intensive process. So the reality is I know that we have a community that's really focused on organic agriculture and on the spectrum moving towards regenerative farming, knowing that farmers can now play this role in addition to providing all of the nutritional needs for cannabis to be absolutely world-class, but further can sequester carbon. And as we've surpassed 415 parts per million of atmospheric carbon, God knows we all have a responsibility to find ways to interact with whether it's production models or other ways of life that are really responding to this incredible concentration of greenhouse gases as we move towards certain heat death. So I do hope that gets to be part of the conversation. That said, I would like to shift to you, sir. Guy, I think about in the role of somebody producing the value-add products and really concerned about product purities, talking about the distinction of producing biomass versus really quality, high oil plants that are distinct. I'm just curious. I know that I'm really aware of current extraction methodologies and whether we're using supercritical fluid extraction and we're moving towards an EVFO, like an extra virgin flower oil, or using sort of whole flowers rather than trim, and trying to use both sub and supercritical or liquid and gaseous extractions to produce more of this whole plant phytochemistry. Where do you see extraction technology going to enhance product viability and purity and anything in that theme?
Yeah, so look, I think that what's happening with most consumers, and we think about organic, is we want the cleanest product possible, right? Most extraction methods are based, again, on yield, which to me is a black market thing. Like, we want the most out of it because it's so valuable. I think even here in Oregon, when you hear rumors that there's more cannabis than we need, so of course, right there, that says extraction should come from flowers and not trim. Typically, extraction used to come from from trim because it was not valuable, and that's what you did. But most of the active ingredient we're looking for is not the chlorophyll or the green matter, but the oil in the glands, and that's where the flower is, right? So what you want is the cleanest extraction method that basically is economically sound. As we grow more cannabis, you can have cleaner extraction methodologies. You don't have to use light hydrocarbon, which I should say I started that. I don't have a problem with light hydrocarbon extraction. As a good scientist, you can get clean medicine out of it, but it's really just a great extraction rate. Same thing with CO2, same thing with cryoethanol. I now am a big solventless proponent because while it doesn't have a high extraction rate, its purity is unparalleled, right? As it relates to the kind of plants and how we grow them, I'll use the hemp example. At our company, we don't say the word hemp. It's all cannabis, right? I appreciate that we have this CBD revolution happening, but we should be using the right cultivars. And if you have a cultivar that's been bred to have low THC, so that technically federally qualifies, that's awesome, but it should have great robust flowers and at least 18% oil by volume, because that's something that you can use a solventless extract or solventless extraction methodology to get pure, clean CBD. The CBD we see out here, it's like most of it is distillate, which suggests a huge chemical process. Is that necessary? It's because the cultivar just won't yield enough, so you have to use these processes. Going forward, we want to grow plants that grow great flowers, and sure, we'll use the trim for something. I hope we can use all parts of the plant. That's just great conservation. But as far as medicine goes, as far as consumable goes, all of it should come from flower. Not just the smokable parts, but every single product that's made, because that's where the oil is. As extractors, of course we want to do nug runs, which is what I think we used to call them in the old days, right? That's just what it should be. And if there's enough cannabis and if the price of the commodity is right, that's what we should be looking to do. And of course, I would then propose, if you have a lot of cannabis, why not get the purest method? Do we have to wait till cannabis is over-refined to say, oh, wait, no, we should go back to clean methods? We've learned that lesson in other consumer products, so why not start clean right now?
Love it. Can you describe a little bit about the evolution of solventless process in your experience?
Yeah. So I was not a fan at first. My first company in Denver, I remember sitting on a panel like this with a gentleman that back when we were still using those hair things to to press rosin, and I was like, that's never gonna work. right? Well, of course, it's because I was still having a big black market mentality, like, well, that yield, it's just not viable, right? It's kind of like the extra virgin olive oil that, now I think that solventless is about the commodity price. The fact is, whether you're ice water hash, whether you're, sifting rosin and sifting keef and pressing that into rosin, whether you're doing a direct lipid infusion, whatever you're doing, it's not going to have the same extraction rate as a CO2 or a cryoethanol or a light hydrocarbon. So the price of the commodity has to be right. The cannabis, the flower product, has to be right in order to make all the other products down the chain viable. At our company, one of the things that we've done is just figured out how to use all of the plant. Right? So of course, if you're not getting a high extraction rate, you need to be able to use different methodologies and applications to get different products, right? So you might dry sieve first, right? Then you might press, and then you might do a direct lipid infusion, all on the same input product, so that when the product leaves your shop, you have garnered all the active ingredients out, but you've done it in a clean way, making your product line across those different steps, being able to use the different infusions for different products. Of course, at the top tier is going to be the vapable or smokable consumables, going all the way down to the last tier that might be infused in a confection or something.
Love it. One thing that you mentioned in using the whole plant, unfortunately, we were not able to be joined by a colleague from Canada named Dr. Natasha Riz this year. She was not able to be here, but I know will be here in the future. Recently, she's been working a lot with root ball medicine and the tricyclic terpenoid content in the roots. I'm curious if you've had any experience with any of the other...
I haven't.
Yes.
I've only heard about it, and I know now in Humboldt there's farmers are trying to reclaim their root ball and see what's going on. I've been so buried in just what we've been doing, I haven't had a chance to grow my mind that way yet.
Neat. I do see this exciting trend of, as you say, with the solventless, more of the genuine representation of the phytochemical inventory that was there in the wisdom of the evolutionary biology of a plant, and to preserve that, to bring that forward. I am frustrated with the amount of distillate-derived products that, unfortunately, like right now, are the price point that seems to kind of work, and there's this whole equation with economics, but I do hope that as production changes over time, we see more and more of that inventory, because I believe we're at a juncture where, well, now most people, I'm sure in this room and beyond, are speaking about terpenoids. The reality is there's so much else to this plant. I think that we're in a conversation with the Smart Cannabis team that's really inspiring about the possibility of inventorying from a variety of other folks, like in the perfumeries and the sort of different places where scent and aroma are really, there's deep insight. It's that it's not just terpenoids that make up an aroma profile, for example. It's that we know that there's, it's aldehydes and esters and ketones and flavonoids and all of the substrata in the phytochemistry. And it seems like before we can even inventory all of that, maybe the neatest thing that we can do is just work towards processes that are trying to capture and preserve as much of it as possible, because it seems to, in general, and I can't wait till there's more evidence to bear this out, perhaps increase therapeutic efficacy and decrease side effects, that there is always something about the whole plant and drug synergy that I'm at least a huge believer in, and I can't wait till we have adequate science and support to demonstrate that.
I think, I long for data, like the data that Alison was talking about, like as we go down and we can see the difference between distillate and real whole plant tinctures, even if we can get to do tests, especially like even if it's just with CBD. But I think that we should all note that distillate disempowers the farmer because it's hiding the input product. And that's a key thing. Again, we don't need to make the same mistakes that other industries have made. Small farmers should be honored now, not 50 years from now when we realize that we made a mistake. And the best way to do that is force them to grow great flowers and extract those great flowers. If mistakes are made and you have to go to distillate, or especially on the CBD side, you have this agricultural hemp that should have never been extracted. It's great for rope, fiber, and everything else, but you should not be putting it in a waters machine to get CBD out of it. It's just not the right plant to do that, right? So distillate kind of makes it seem like big corporate farms, large-scale farms that don't really care about what the flowers look like, get cropped, processed into distillate, and then terpenes are re-added. That sounds so pharma-like, and I'm not particularly happy with the way farmers treated us. So it seems like we know the things that are wrong. Why would we make those same mistakes as an industry right now?
Woo! Yes. Okay. I'm wondering if either of you have anything to say about this processing technology aspect of our conversation.
Yeah, What we are doing, we are using supercritical CO2 in a very slow process, so we are not stripping out any sugars or chlorophyll in the way how we are processing it, and that allows us to avoid any kind of post-processing and winterization, which goes awfully close to the chemotypical profile of the original flower. I think it's very, very important to especially patients that are used to a flower product that helps with their specific ailment to have an alternative as an oil that is almost a one-to-one representation of the flower. From a medical perspective and being a scientist by training, it makes it very difficult to distinguish the efficacy of all these components, though, that are in a whole flower or in an oil product. So I think there's something that we can do. We should analyze data, acquire as much data as we can, and run like meta-analysis and create correlations, and I think the Cultivation Classic is helping with that, to understand what kind of composition of the cannabinoids and terpenes are helping with a certain ailment. And on the other side of the spectrum, I think it's equally important to understand what each component is actually doing in our bodies. And pairing that together will make us much better progress in the search for the plant and what it can actually do for the ailments that we are looking at and treating.
Yeah, I want to just comment on that. That's the problem, I think, with cannabis and traditional medicine. Traditional medicine wants to look at each individual API and find out what it's doing, and that's the only way you can figure it out. Like, it's like, this does this next component does this, whereas whole plant or natural medicine or herbal medicine or Chinese medicine takes a different approach, and that's difficult because each plant and each strain is different. Each person is different, and so how can you say general things, right? Right now we talk about indica, sativa, we talk about some terpene profiles, but it's really stabs in the dark, right? This is a complex thing where you have so many different actives in one plant. Each individual is different. We don't know what all the actives do. We know there's a synergistic effect. There's resistance from folks like me to separate it into distinct distilled APIs. So I'm just articulating the problem. I have no idea what the solution is because that's what that's what we're talking about. But yeah, we want to have this natural whole plant medicine because we know there's synergy there. We know there's something natural there, but we have no idea how we can make generalizations so that we could tell average consumers or laymen, here, this is what you need, right? We're just not there yet. There's just too many complex variables. So while I do think scientists need to isolate each API and do individual tests, that then I would like to be, hopefully could be correlated back to a whole plant medicine. So we could look at the whole plant, look at the APIs, and say this whole plant medicine will do this.
Love it. Okay, on that, just riffing, in Europe, there is a standard called Nutriceuticals, which does not exist in the US. Here we have either a botanical supplement or we have a pharmaceutical drug. The distinction in a regulatory perspective is that on the pharmaceutical drug development, you have to prove that it will cause no harm by incredibly expensive clinical trials. On the other hand, we have a legacy at this point in the US of producing some really bad, crappy supplements that do not have the active ingredients or do not have the effects that people would be pursuing from a plant medicine. It does seem like there's some future where somewhere in between those, where we could actually have consistent inventory in a plant of the active ingredients and even be able to label and know what those active ingredients are, that would help to kind of broker a future that I think is a lot more inspiring than having this incredible paradox of either pharmaceutical companies controlling all of the real revenue creation and market share supported by health insurance and so forth, and then all of the craft farmers left out of that incredible dialogue when actually we have the ability to improve the people's quality of life really directly with the plants we're growing in our own backyards. There's a really revolutionary implication in that. But I always think that there's this interesting thing about something you said, Lasse, of a both-and approach. That sort of we are in the period of unbelievable discovery, but we're also in a room full of a lot of passionate people. And I know that in myself, I find myself tending towards kind of taking an extreme passionate view. And I do think right now there's this really healthy attitude about we need a both and dialogue. I think there's no part of this conversation that we shouldn't be inquiring into to try to substantiate what we know and to increase that knowledge, not just for us, but when we go, what we can leave behind. So really excited to hear more about that dialogue. I would love to focus on you, Lasse, thinking about your role in Peace Naturals and your care and passion for therapeutic outcomes. Oh, goodness, wait, there's actually two things I have to say. So important. I can't let these ones go. Okay, 2 points that I think could help us to advance right now without some big theoretical support or further research. One, I am over everybody calling FICO or RSO products that are essentially an ethanol hash oil. I think that we should catch up. I'm just going to personally advocate, after my dear friend Jeff Wilhoit on the Shaping Fire podcast recently advocated, that we just do away with that crap. Let's talk about the solvent that we're using, if we're using a solvent, honestly. And I like this notion of, instead of FICO, which is very confusing considering you're using ethanol and stripping everything away, maybe we could say EHO, ethanol hash oil, and that would be then congruent with BHO, PHO, et cetera. I just would like to advocate for that piece. And then secondly, no, actually, I'm going to leave the second piece because I know where I'm going to tie it in. Back to you. Lasse, what I know is that you have this huge passion for the plant changing people's quality of life and really pursuing, with a lot of resources and incredible science, the depth of insight about sort of some of the human health implications. And I'm wondering if you could share where you see research going in the future to continue to substantiate, from a both-and perspective, sort of the human health effect of this rich pharmacology that the plant is providing.
Yeah, so what I liked with the stories that I like to bring also to the cultivation team and also our production staff are the stories that I'm hearing from client care. So we are hearing stories, for example, someone calling in, having insomnia for 40 years and being able to sleep the first time more than 4 hours a night. These are wonderful stories and show what kind of potential this kind of medicinal plant has. We have a lot to learn. We have to understand, with the tremendous amount of information we have gathered in the past already, what the whole flower product can already do and what can it treat. We have an entire catalog of information from questionnaires that we are handing out to patients that are giving us valuable information on the respective components that might be responsible to help patients. And that is important to keep in mind, and we need to run much more research in that area. At the same time, it is very important to analyze the individual compounds. One of the problems that medical practitioners are facing is, we are hearing that all the time, and with the doctors that I'm working with, I would love to prescribe cannabis, but I don't know what all these components are doing. And that is a big problem. Medical practitioners are so used to prescribing a medication that has a very specific formulation. It is approved, it has been studied, and what makes them more comfortable to prescribing that drug. So in that sense, we have to conduct more research, working as a community also together. This is not something that a single institution can do or a single licensed producers can do. It is something that the entire cannabis community has to tackle together, and with time we will be able to understand what the individual compounds are also doing, and using also the plant as a blueprint of what nature is actually providing, and then mimicking it in the lab, in actual clinical trials, and properly designed and run studies to show efficacy, what is actually happening. So there's still a long road ahead, but working all together and sharing the information in fora like this, at conferences, going to visit scientists that visit each other to exchange information. These are all very important compounds to get there a little bit faster.
Okay, so the second piece, which now is the perfect tie-in, we have the great privilege of being joined by Dr. Ethan Russo. Dr. Ethan Russo, if people aren't familiar, is one of the main proponents of a more whole plant perspective, but with advocacy for rigorous science to understand the relationships between the diverse compounds in cannabis. In fact, I wouldn't be in this room, and I think most of us wouldn't be in this room, if it weren't for the tremendous legacy and life's work that he has authored. So we're very grateful to have you here. And one of the recent ideas that I've heard, I think most people are aware that actually the entourage effect was first coined in, I believe, the late 90s by Professor Meshulam, talking about the synergy between, or interactions rather, between THC and CBD. And later, under the leadership of Dr. Russo and now many others joining in that conversation, the entourage effect went to be broader and inclusive of more of the compounds and chemistry, specifically focusing on terpenes. One of the recent evolutions, and this is back to a simple practical idea that is not mine, that I think is a brilliant notion, is shifting this dialogue from the entourage effect, which we've all seen this crap show, and it's like there's like a rock star, and there's these people that like follow the rock star, and it's like this like awful, like, oh no, your life is, okay. But that actually better than this entourage that follows around THC as the rock star, and a far more exciting, I think, worldview is this notion of the ensemble effect. I think it's time to just go forward. I would like to see EHO and the ensemble effect enter our vernacular, because this ensemble, you're not going to sort of be able to suggest that the viola player is more important than the cellist or the bass player and in fact, this is actually being borne out in research. We know, if you're familiar with Dr. David Marie, Didi has talked about these things in terms of THC not being the protagonist in the story, in particular therapeutic effects. Certainly Ethan and many others have described this, but in any case, I think how, as we deal with the ensemble effects, can we pursue research that deals with these relationships? Thinking about the classical pharma mode of having a single metabolite validated through double-blind, peer-reviewed clinical trials, and how we have this huge inventory, according to Lumiere, maybe 1,000 compounds in the plant. It could take us 1,000 lifetimes to know anything about all of these things if we're looking at individual variables. This is for the group. Is there any sort of methodology by which you see emerging to substantiate complex, more whole plant sort of ways to substantiate what is these more targeted therapeutic outcomes, these multivariable equations and technologies that might be useful as we approach this incredible complexity? Do you have any ideas about that stuff, Lasse?
It's a very difficult question.
Come on, solve it. We need this.
But how I like to view biological systems is holistically. It's really important, the complexity that involves biological systems on a plant level, but also as humans. There's so many interactions with compounds that we are consuming that have an impact on our well-being. We have social interactions that have an impact on our well-being, and seeing how we are interacting with our environment plays into it as well. When it comes to compounds that we are consuming, I like to compare the entourage effect with eating a vitamin pill, which is doing a little bit good for you, but if you're eating the same amount of vitamins in actual apple, in a salad, in a healthy diet, you're consuming all the minerals, you're consuming the fibers, and ultimately you are at a better health than you would if you are just eating the vitamin pill. How or why the whole holistic view and the holistic health approach is better than consuming just a vitamin pill, this is a very difficult challenge that we have to address and research a little more detail.
Yeah, this is a good one. My take is that whole plant medicine is safer than going down the road of single API. Pharma will give us a medicine that's been researched, double-blind study, and will still have a huge side effect potential. Something like 30% may experience these side effects. Cannabis, with its history, even when poorly grown, with pesticides and black market, still comes out as a safe bet. I'm a former US Navy vet, and that's a big thing for me. The things that we prescribe for PTSD are unconscionable. Whereas, kind of the safety, like, the concept of doctors being uncomfortable to prescribe cannabis, I can appreciate that because that's not how they were taught. However, before you give a vet some of these toxins that are literally can cause them to have suicide, you should just be prescribing cannabis because at the very least, while not understood, it's safe. So I would start the conversation with natural medicines like fruit and vegetables are exactly that, natural. So let's start prescribing those with the quickness, and then, yeah, I know it's backwards, figure out what they do wrong, or what might be wrong, or how it's working. When we think about cancer patients, as opposed to taking a bunch of opiates, I'd rather see them on a high THC tincture for pain management, which would increase their appetite and kill their nausea. I'm not sure what else is all in that strain, but I do know that over the opiates, which will cause constipation and eventually force them to lose the fight against chemo, cannabis of any strain and any access would be better, right? So safe access to cannabis, yeah, I mean, again, we're coming off an industry that I often say this is the most American thing I've ever done. We fought the law and we won. And the reason is because this plant is so amazing, right? And we just need to honor that. And while the way we've traditionally gone and took willow bark to make aspirin and distilled single API is okay, and I'm not throwing that out, I'm just saying with this particular plant, it does have a lot, I dare say decades and decades and decades of being used by many, many people in a safe manner. And it's so much safer than some of the pharma alternatives that we need to just jump right in. And so if I were speaking to doctors, I'd be like, I appreciate that I can't give you the studies that you would typically get when you get a Xanax, when you get an opioid product. However, I would tell you that this, you can rest assured that you will not have deleterious side effects from your patient. It may not work, and they may need to find another strain, they may need to find another application, they may need to find different dosing, but what they won't have is a backslide of side effects.
Well said. So I would like to move back to another area of production scientists that I know at least 3 of us have been focused on in a pretty intensive way. And this is something that is a huge variable in producing the phytochemistry in cannabis. The discipline of photobiology, or the research about the influence of light wavelength and intensity on plant morphology and phytochemical development, is clearly one of the most important sciences to grasp from a production perspective if our goal is to harness particular phytochemical profiles. I can say that at Pruf we finished a year-long research effort that was partnered with Fluence Bioengineering, where a Dr. Bruce Bugbee, if you've not been familiar with this person, highly recommend looking into him. He is a grower for NASA. He's a horticulturalist who works at University of Utah and is a leading plant physiologist, but has really become kind of the godfather of photobiology research. But we worked on a near-red and a far-red broad spectrum solution from an LED perspective, and after about a year of producing results, the far red, which included a 730 nanometer peak, you have this visible light spectrum between 4 and 700, so we're getting into this like what human eyes can't detect well, and we understand that also plants can see more light, like photosynthetic active radiation, which extends on both sides, but that we're probably moving into a world of BAR, or biological active radiation, which actually goes even further into the invisibles on both sides, because really we see that all of these lights, whether it's UV or the far red, are having important effects on cannabis. But what I will share with you, we haven't published this, we probably may not even publish this, but I want to share with you what I observed in our study, which is simply that the inclusion of the far red light in plants will respond in either a shade avoidant or a shade tolerant behavior. Cannabis clearly is a shade avoider, which means it grows lankier and taller. And that morphology in most production environments is very undesirable unless you're dealing with a very, very compact plant. Most of the plants that we work with that have great phytochemical inventory are not compact. And in fact, compact canopies is one of the keys to having uniform UMOL intensity. To receive the same amount of light on all of the flowering tops is going to make for a consistent expression of the chemovar. And so it's this interesting thing where the far red light did increase some biomass, did not have anything that we can show in terms of phytochemical impact, but was one of the first pieces of cannabis-specific photobiology research that I've seen other than the work that you have done. Could you speak a little bit about the photobiology effort?
Absolutely. So LEDs in general has really been a game changer for Outco. Simply put, it started as basically a way to dispel the myth that you can't flower under LEDs. You know, everybody wanted to tell me that, and, you know, I really had no opinion one way or the other, so, you know, let's do a trial. Worked with Fluence, the scientists there at the time, and did some intensity studies, basically. And what we found is, yes, you can absolutely flower under LEDs, and that cannabis loves light. It loves a lot of light. So, you know, we made a fixture specifically for this study to be able to reach, you know, a ppfd of 1200, and, you know, we didn't tap out. Coming from other crops, I thought, well, this, you know, these plants are going to get burned, there's going to be problems, and there are some cultivars which, you know, morphologically they might look a little funky under the really high light, but if you're extracting and you're looking for yield or basically secondary metabolite concentration per square foot, it is a good thing. But the other biggest conclusion from our LED study was, well, you know, in our county, they prohibited us from expanding horizontally, but we had really, really tall ceilings. And so we could expand vertically. So, you know, in a place where we were stuck at a certain square footage because of, you know, accepting a technology that's different, going through the proper trialing without opinion or emotion, you know, wrapped around a certain way of growing, you know, we were very easily able to double our canopy by accepting this. And, you know, since then, of course, with changing any sort of grow methodology, there were problems, and, you know, humidity was terrible, and there were lots we had to do as far as, you know, figuring out irrigation and airflow on the different levels. But in all, you know, it was a great thing for us. And so our facility has been switched over from HPS lights to double stack rolling benches, and I think we're at 2.8 times the canopy because of it.
Amazing. Lasse, I know also that you've been involved with some photobiology work. Is there anything that you can speak about with regard to light recipes and the impact on morphology or phytochemistry at this point?
Yeah, for sure. The cannabis plant and most plants, for that matter, are very, very sensitive towards the light spectra that they are exposed to. And in the cannabis, I think it took on a much more important role because we are or have been growing in indoor environments where the sole light source is the luminaire that you are having in your tent or in your grow room. So if you are having that, the light spectrum becomes so much more important, and the plant is able to react to these changes over time. The plasticity of the expression of photoabsorbing pigments is quite large. The plant needs to be adopted to like changes in light intensity and also to different light spectra if it's used in veg versus flower. But the plasticity is there for the plant to use different photons of a different wavelength and also reacting with a different phytochemical profile if that is actually done. The phytochemical profile will change quite drastically if you have like an illuminaire that exhibits photons at 450 and 650 nanometers versus full spectrum light. You will see a very, very different phytochemical profile, and this is incredibly important to respect and also to understand when we are producing for medical patients. Because in medical patients, we talked a lot about the phytochemical profile and the interactions that are so different. For me, the most predominant influencer of the phytochemical profile is light. There's a little bit nutrition and also environment playing a role, but predominantly it's light that is going to change the phytochemical profile. And if you're not consistent with it, as we have like different kind of grow rooms and we are growing a cultivar in one grow room that has a different light source versus the other, but we are selling it as the exact same cultivar to patients, they might get a complete different medications every single time. And it's something that we as growers, we have the responsibility to be cognizant of that so that we are providing patients and end consumers with a more consistent and clean product.
Love it. One of the things that I'm aware of that often is talked about in Oregon is that, of course, we really prefer using solar radiation. It is the most efficient way to capture broad spectrum light. It is, however, quite variable. And one of the remarkable things is, like, there are many things that this plant is doing. Of course, one of our passions is about serving these therapeutic outcomes or making consistent product qualities for the value-add products. But in any case, if we are caring for patients, it is clear that at Pruf I had in Light Diet A a combination of double-ended high-pressure sodiums and plasma lights, ultimately a chemovar that was producing 2.5% terpenes that was dominated by myrcene and limonene, and then the exact same chemovar, the same plant that I had a cutting of in a different environment under a broad spectrum LED fluent solution, had double the output of terpenes and had a different composition of the terpenes. So rather than the myrcene and limonene, now terpinolene and caryophyllene. And so it's really remarkable to think about nothing else that, changed clearly, if you're really doing rigorous studies, you have to measure every imaginable thing, including the tiniest amounts of airflow and et cetera. But these were very, very parallel plants. So in any case, I just suggest that there's this grand palette and spectrum by which, through production science, through research, through rigorous study, working together and sharing things, we have this huge frontier to explore for a long, long time. I look forward to sharing in that in our community, and I'm very, very grateful to the three of you coming from your communities to bring these riches and to share them with ours. It means the world to us. We are out of time, and it's just been an honor to get to sit with the three of you.